Good evening, everybody. My name is Pavia Lal. I'm the former Associate Administrator for Technology Policy and Strategy at NASA. We have a star-studded panel for you here to talk about maturing space investments. So without much ado, let me just first start by thanking the IAF and the organizers of the IAC for the opportunity to be here today. I want to particularly thank the members of the Investment Task Force for proposing this panel. So our goal is to talk today about, with these amazing panelists, about where space investment is headed as venture funding grows, or venture-funded firms grow. Let me start by introducing the panel. We have Donna Baki, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at the Exploration Company. We have Pacom Revillon, who is the CEO of Euroconsult. We have the amazing Carissa Bryce Christensen, CEO of Bryce Tech. And we have Kevin O'Connell, who runs this cool-sounding company called Space Economy Rising. Love the name. It's an advisory firm on space strategy, regulation, and finance. And if you all know, Kevin used to be the director of the Office of Space Commerce, the Department of Commerce, a few years ago. So with that, let me open up the questions. I have a whole bunch of questions. We have a time limit, but if I run out or if you have burning questions, let's figure out a way to get you up here, but I'll get started with what I have here. So I will start with Carissa. Give us some insights into the state of investing in space today. Who are these investors? Where are they? What's the size of the investment? What are the areas in which these investments are the strongest, the weakest? Lay of the land, Carissa. And again, if after you, Pacom, you can go and give your perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pavia. It's a pleasure to be here. And I do want to thank the IAF for establishing the Investment Task Force as part of the Security Investment Sustainability Initiative. The task force is working across the IAF to bring more investment-related content to the IAC and to work with the IAF to be an effective advocate for investment in space. And so to answer your question, Poppy, why is that important? What's going on in terms of investment in space? In the last decade, we have seen our industry transformed. And it's been transformed by a wave of venture investment and investment by space-focused billionaires that has resulted in 500 or so startup companies, dramatic changes in the business models across the industry, a transformation in global launch, a move toward mass production of satellites rather than a tiny number of satellites. That investment has been on the order of $60 billion US. In addition, concurrently to that, government budgets globally for space have been increasing, and the long-standing space actors, prime contractors, aerospace and defense firms, have continued to invest on their own in their capabilities in very advanced technology, in facilities, in infrastructure. And so particularly this venture investment has driven price pressure, has driven changes in government acquisition, so governments are buying space products and services in a different way, and created a mainstream level of interest and engagement in the business of space. As far as what kinds of companies received that investment, if you envision a pie chart, almost half of that pie chart is launch related. Almost half of that pie chart is satellite services and satellite manufacturing. And then a relatively small wedge is for what we might call in-space activities other than the satellite value chain and launch, in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing, commercial exploration, and so on. So we could talk about this probably for the full time of our panel and then some, so I'll pause there and look forward to your next question.
Pacom?
Better with my low voice. Okay, so even when discussing with certain government organizations, working with startups, new companies, for them is also a challenge in terms of sustainability. They want to have partners long term, they may invest, but they may not be the only client of those organizations. So whereby the question of that financing and global business models makes sense. So with what Carissa said, which is very true, two only comments is that when we talk about new space, if I put SpaceX aside 20 years ago, quite a number of organizations have started maybe 5 to 10 years ago now, around 2015 plus. And many of those companies are also coming to seed, round A to now round B, C financing, where we've seen a lot of venture capital, but now those are also coming to more development investment companies in the next stage. And that financing has been very local for a part, so US for US startups, European and so forth, with some exceptions. But we also see now some more funds coming, for example, from Middle Eastern funds coming into play, some others. So some of them government-related, some of them privately driven, also coming into the industry and supporting the next stage of development of those companies. So then in the principle of reality, some of those investors are also now willing to make a return on their investment, and we are also at that time, but we may discuss that later in the panel, I suppose.
Thank you. And actually, before I forget, tomorrow at 10 o'clock, there is a session on practical issues on investing in the space industry. And Carissa, when you have a moment, you can tell the team, the folks here, more about it. But moving on our questions for today. So a question for Donna. For an industry that has seen so much influx of venture capital, and as Carissa and Paco mentioned, hundreds of space startups, what is the next step? Where do companies go after venture capital? And then actually, just so we have continuity, Kevin, if you can comment on how do senior decision makers, both in the private sector and the government, see space as a source of institutional investment opportunities? So similar topics, different perspectives.
Is this working now? Okay, great. For a little bit of background, my previous life, I founded another company that had nothing to do in space that ultimately raised several rounds of funding and that was acquired by Uber. So I have a bit of a background on fundraising to say, okay, where do we go once we've hit this venture capital, once we've hit the edge of the venture capital loop? Really, companies need to be thinking about their exit strategy at the end of the day. You can raise several rounds of venture capital funding, but ultimately you're only going to hit a cap, so maybe D, Series D level, and you need to start looking at other ways of funding your business. At that point, it's going to be very important that our businesses in the space industry can prove profitability, because that's what opens the doors for companies past that point. The two big options past venture funding are private equity funding and IPO. For both of these options, there's two really important factors. One is profitability, and two is the opportunities for scale that still exist. Because those funders are also looking to get an ROI on their investment. It might not be 10x like a VC, but they do necessarily need to see a really good return on their investment. And so as we are all progressing within this VC space and funding space within the space ecosystem, we need to start thinking about what are our exits? What are those going to look like? How do we build a path to profitability that is a strong path to profitability that compares to other industries? Because there's no space PE firms, right? So how do we build a case for our businesses that are just as strong as businesses in other industries?
So first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to join this panel on the last minute notice, and so I'm delighted to be here. I'd start by seconding the points made already about the IAF's interest in this area. I love to start any presentation in the space community by saying that space is about economics, which usually gets a really weird look from people in the audience, but it really is. There's so many dimensions of space that today are economic in nature. When it comes to the stakeholders, governments and the private finance, both are very important aspects of growing the space economy, obviously. But they're working in different ways. Pacom has already highlighted, certainly in the work of Euroconsult, the growing expenditures by governments in this area, and notice, frankly, by sovereign wealth funds of what is going on in the use of commercial assets for many, many different purposes, including security. On the other hand, the private finance community has gone through a bit of a transformation itself, from a tumultuous $47 million in 2021 to 20 last year, and now we're back to a single-digit number as we start seeing the investments grow again. We're seeing a return to investment in a couple of areas. We can talk about that again. What I'd point to here, though, is a synergy between the way governments think about this and private finance thinks about it, and they can actually leverage nicely each other's. Today, governments can actually send important signals into the market by spending small amounts of money on interesting ideas and things like that, that can then get a reaction from the private capital markets as to whether or not they're purely a government mission for the short term or they're a much longer term commercial horizon. And that's the basis for private investment. So there's a newfound synergy between what governments and private finance are doing.
And I would say, as suggested, government can be a direct investor, indeed, in some cases, but the majority of the impact is with the government being an enabler. Obviously, it can support some R&D, funding, etc. But after that is about to what extent the government can be a client. Indeed, it doesn't have to be the only client, but the reality of space businesses, with the time it takes, with the technology challenges and so forth, is that some government entities, one or several of them, have to be anchor or significant customers of many of the businesses. And that also gives confidence to the financial community in terms of visibility. So many space businesses are very dual, some civil and security, some very private and civil government, but government has a role to play in many and many of those business cases.
Thank you. So going back to Carissa, building on what Donna had said, are we seeing deals in space beyond where private equity or other investments are active? What are some opportunities in space that may be attractive to investors? What are the most promising markets? What are the least promising markets?
So this is the question, isn't it? Where are we going? Because as Pacom quite rightly brought up, investors like to see returns on their investment. And to pull the thread on the government discussion, because it's really relevant to this, in addition to the mechanisms Kevin talked about, Pacom talked about, government agencies have become really important customers for the commercial space community. When the venture wave started, I had a conversation with a company I will not name, whose founder I knew well, who knew my company's work. I said, can we help you? And he said, you know what? We're so commercial. We're not even going to look at government as a customer. We're completely commercial. So within,
that.
I think, 4 years, they had started a federal services division specifically marketing the U.S. government, because finding those non-governmental industrial or consumer customers was challenging. This was a remote sensing company. So that's where are those future most promising markets? So far, the big space markets we've had, the huge financial wins, I would characterize as one, video, particularly direct home television, but essentially television over satellites was a big money maker for a very long time. That market is still very substantial. It drove the geosatellite industry, but it's declining because of the way television viewership is changing. So that market is under pressure. The other is GNSS, products and services, which is sort of an interesting, it's a very commercial marketplace built on nationally owned satellites like the US GPS system and multiple systems around the world. And so, the navigation tools on your phone, the logistics tools used by major corporations, that's another roughly $100 billion market. We could define it differently, but so those are the two big commercial space markets we have seen to date. where's the next $100 billion market coming from? So there's, I think, hope that we will see a massive telecommunications market driven by the global broadband capabilities of systems like SpaceX's Skynet, OneWeb, but now Eutelsat's OneWeb, and Amazon Kuiper, among others. Those systems are well positioned in that telecommunications is a massive market. There's significant demand. However, I would argue that the business case is not closed there. It's not proven. They're still in early stages or even just beginning to deploy. And those satellite systems are seeking to serve underserved populations. And are there enough of those underserved populations? Or provide emergency services, or potentially to get mass growth, compete with terrestrial providers. And that's very challenging for space systems on quality and on price. So that's an interesting area of growth. I think another really critical area of growth will be government customers, particularly in the national security arena. As nation states become more and more concerned about geopolitical conflict and reliant on space capabilities to manage that conflict. And so that is going to be an important part of our commercial space future. Are we seeing deals? We're starting to see some private equity in space. KKR just invested in OHB, for example. We're not really seeing those venture-funded firms at that point yet, although we are seeing venture-funded firms growing to the point where they're buying each other. We're seeing a bit of a trend there. To Dana's very good point, scalability, and some degree of predictable revenue is going to be really critical to see those larger next phase deals.
Thanks, Carissa. So the next follow-on question from that is, what are some of the challenges to attracting investors to space? What are some of these hard-earned lessons for both investors and other decision makers from the last decade or so? And maybe, Paco, we could start with you, then Dana, and Kevin, and then Carissa, if you could wrap it up.
Well, a great question. So first, maybe a comment. If you take a step back, it's nothing space, but obviously the economy as it is, the global context for investors is what it is. So I don't think I've met executive from a startup or even larger company saying that raising money is easy at the moment. So that may be a first comment. So that being said, what's challenging about space is, well, obviously just the technology, any delay. For some business, the time it takes to build a customer base. We talk about the governments, not so easy to get any contract from any government. That can be a multi-year effort, but as well very much from any enterprise client. You need to understand its process, its use case and everything. That's taking time. And for investors, time is quite often the enemy in terms of when they will be making a return, if any. So I think why I would fully concur with Carissa in some of the directions. What will matter for investors right now is also how unique your business is. You may go after the big global market or well-identified niche when there is a role to play, there are clients to serve, there is money to make that can be pretty well identified, and where you can really make a difference. And that will matter to investors, and that can be a challenge. So being a Me Too right now in the current environment may not be so great. So for investors, they may be happy that you're the best company on earth to do air traffic management for aircraft, or you're the best for a security application of some sort. And that's worth investing into a business for sure. So that's kind of uniqueness, differentiation, especially at this point in time, I think is very important for investors.
I think space is rather daunting for people. We take it for granted that we understand what's happening in the industry and how it works. But I mean, when you introduce yourself to someone and tell them you work in space, I think the first thing is, wow, rocket scientists, I'm never going to be able to understand this. And I think it's the same phenomenon with investors that they need a lot of, it's true, they do need a lot of education on what's happening in the industry and what matters and how it's different to other industries and all of those pieces. So I think one is putting them at ease is a challenge. Two is providing them with the education they need to understand exactly what the lay of the land is, what are the differences in the space industry versus other industries. But then lastly is a challenge for us to de-risk the industry as much as it can be de-risked. Now, space is risky. You can't de-risk to that amount, but anything that you can do to provide investors with the comfort to say, we've thought of all of these risks, and this is exactly how we are de-risking each one of these, and this is how it fits the story, really gives them confidence in what you're doing in a space that they may not be as comfortable in as other industries.
Education is absolutely key here, not only for the public at large, we always talk about that, but equally important, what's the return on investment to politicians, presidents, prime ministers, who have to make very, very hard choices about things that they have to invest in? So we have to think about that community as well. I remain optimistic, partly based on the amount of seed investment that has already gone into the space economy. You know, almost $300 billion over the last decade. That number is skewed a little bit by SpaceX, but there's a wide range of market verticals which have been invested in by enthusiastic investors. And one of the places we're seeing a comeback right now, early in 23, the seed investments, the early stage, the risk-taking investments are on the rise again. And so you can look at any one of a number of verticals. Now, again, as has been said, people have to understand what they're investing in. But remember, historically, we used to talk about remote sensing, weather, communications, and navigations, kind of the old-fashioned commercial aspects of space. Today, we're talking about cryptography in space, space medicine, and a dozen other verticals where people have actually made substantial investments. They may not all succeed, certainly not all companies will succeed, but I'm impressed by the diversity of areas which have been invested in so far.
What's challenging about space investments? We hear all the time it's capital intensive, and the timelines are long. So what does that really mean in practical terms? Well, let's think about where we are right now. We've had this massive influx of venture investment. We've had startups. They've been developing for 5 years, 7 years. At this point, in a transformed, extraordinarily increased level of activity space ecosystem, I mean, we had 1,000 active satellites on orbit 10 years ago. We're close to 10,000 now. The number of launches is at an all-time high. New infrastructure. We've seen a lot of activity. What we haven't seen is a definitive set of meaningful and impressive financial exits. Nobody yet has made a huge amount of money as an investor. Some of the SPAC investors did okay, but those companies that went public at a very early stage have struggled to keep their stock prices up. So because space activities cost a lot, and because it takes a good long time to develop and deploy in-space hardware, the industry is at this moment, even after these years of investment activity, still poised for that market success that will really drive the next level of investment. And we will see successes in some areas, and we will see failures in some areas. And that's the other point I wanted to make is, when we talk about space, we say as a shorthand, space markets. And the example I always like to give is, what if I came to you and I said, would you like to invest in ocean markets? You would say, well, Carissa, do you mean a snorkeling company, or do you mean offshore oil drilling, or do you mean cruise ships? And that's the level of differentiation we have in space markets. There are so many, to Kevin's excellent point, there are so many different types of products and services, and each one of those arenas has a different risk profile, a different cost profile, a different customer profile, and a different investor profile. And so I absolutely agree that helping to educate the broader population of investors about those market segmentations is really critical. And on that topic, as Pavya mentioned, tomorrow we are going to do a bit of a briefing on space investment with a little bit of a practical tone. We'll go through the trends in each of those segments of space markets, and then talk about what that means for investment. Pacom has very kindly agreed to do that as well Pavia, and a couple of other folks will join us. That is tomorrow at 10 in balcony D2 over in the convention center. So I hope that you can join us for that. And then I will end my commercial.
I'll be there for sure.
We'll be there.
No, and fully agreeing that it's difficult to talk among all of those segments with various maturity, etc. It's also true that right now, having certain success stories, certain exist. First companies have come now, they're operational. For some years they were developing, now they have services in the market. So it's a bit of a reality check, how quickly can this grow, turn into revenue, profit, etc. So as venture capital works, you don't need every company to succeed, but you need to have some great success. That's what matters at the end of the day. And it is that what will be important. There will be success, but how many and how big will drive some of the interest for investors, I think, in the next few years.
And to be fair, I mean, we have to talk about SpaceX, which has a massive valuation, has something like 40% of global market share, has transformed launch in the world. So certainly there's nothing that you can call that company but a success, but it has not had a large financial return for investors to this point.
So I want to keep asking questions, but while I ask the next one, I want any of you who have any burning questions to come up to the microphones. I hope they work. Or we will find out. Oh, there's a held microphone too. So my next question actually is for Kevin, since you've been in government. What is the role of government in encouraging private investment in space? What are some things the government should, and more importantly, shouldn't do? And again, if others want to jump in, please do feel free.
So governments still play a very important role in setting national strategy, governance under the Outer Space Treaty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At a very top level, almost doesn't need to be said that there has to be a positive business climate for the kind of innovation that we seek in the space business and a lot of other areas. We've had conversations here already at IAC about countries that struggle a bit with that. A national space law and space strategy are very, very helpful to this. And then in many countries, there is not a climate that would encourage a commercial space industry to thrive. As one colleague said, we have to be smart partners in order to partner with others. And so there's a wide range of things that governments can do in addition to funding projects. But at least based on my own experience, money is not the only answer. Many people say, well, we don't have much money to do this. There are many things that governments can do. They can bring people together. They can publish statistics about what goes on nationally. They can assess the industrial base and the academic community for the viability of what they can do. Lots of things that governments can do. Obviously, thinking about regulation and what would encourage the use of a commercial space capability in country is very, very important. And then finding sources of financing within the government for activities either at home or abroad.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. I think government, so space needs to become a global economy across countries. And governments within each country needs to play a role in building the industry in their countries. If they want to build a space industry, they have to be a client, one, but then they also have to play a role in making it a global market for the companies within their industries. Other than the US, which is enormous on its own, very few industries will probably be able to survive if they're only working within the market that they're in. And so you need the governments to really be building bridges across countries for cooperations. And so one is to show confidence in the companies within your countries to say, we believe in them and we're their client, but also to get into bartering arrangements, to enable meetings, to really be there in promoting the industry in their countries, because without which we're not going to succeed. We need it to be a global effort.
I think if you ask too many companies, the one thing they would like is government to make decisions faster. That's always been a topic that will be in 100 years, I suspect. That's one. No, then giving also visibility and stability is one. And coming back maybe very concretely as well to the regulatory environment. If I take the case of remote sensing, why do you buy information? You buy it because it's more efficient, will make you earn more money, or you will save money thanks to it, or you will use it because you have to, because of regulation, you need to measure something, you need to report, you need to do something, a cadastre, pollution, whatever, emissions, and so forth. So certain of those regulations, especially if relevant and if they are implemented with pretty concrete measures, then give the basis for the use of certain capabilities. So as well, government can be a client, but also can put in place a framework that then will create a demand, where it makes sense, obviously.
So two quick comments on there. One, I think you'll be surprised by this, but I will say one of the most valuable things governments can do to support and foster commercial space is more regulation, which is not what you expect. And here's why. Because gaps in regulation, uncertainty about regulation, creates an enormous amount of risk for business operations. So no company wants to be over-regulated, no company wants excess regulations, but arenas in which clearly there will be some government regulatory role where there is no existing regime or where there are wildly inconsistent regimes, nation to nation, are really problematic for businesses to grow. And the second area I would raise is governments increasingly are going to have to be coping with the consequences of climate change. Putting aside the question of addressing, trying to achieve net zero, getting there, simply operating, nations simply coping and surviving with the consequences of more severe weather, of rising water levels, and so on, is going to create, frankly, a large business area, and space has a role to play there. And so I think that managing those challenges effectively really does, governments are going to need to use space assets and capabilities in order to do that. So
I would say more efficient regulation rather than more regulation.
There's
that's
a
me.
Goldilocks zone there.
yeah, just get rid of the uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely.
So any questions from the floor? There's a question over there.
Hi. On the topic of maturing space investments, I have a question for representative consulting firms here. Have you ever considered a separate type of capital, which I would refer to myself to as, passion capital? So those are the individuals that made their money in other technology or crypto or something else, and they are investing in space just because of their passion. We have here on the exhibition floor, we have the companies that were funded by crypto billionaires. We have the companies that were funded by, Jeff Bezos of this world, or, Japanese billionaires who are basically co-funding the big Starship missions together with SpaceX and other governments. Have you considered that this is like a separate type of capital? If yes, maybe there are some efforts to promote more people who made their money somewhere else to invest in space. Is it something that can be considered as like a separate type of capital?
If I could maybe, so I think the question is capital going into space in some way different or separate from mainstream capital?
Yeah, because you have VCs, you have PEs, you have the government, but is this a sort of like a different column of
All
capital?
the instruments in use.
Yeah, so I'm sure others will have comments on the instruments and structure, but I'll make a note about the dynamics of space investment that I think is interesting, and it speaks to what Dana was saying about space being a bit intimidating. And also, in the early 2000s, an absolutely verboten subject for investors because of the losses of Iridium and Globalstar and that late 1990s round of commercial space investment. So we interviewed venture capital investors for a study, and It's on our website. You're welcome to take a look. And one of the things they said was that when Elon Musk, when Jeff Bezos became involved in space deals, that made it easier for them to bring space opportunities to their partners. So if I'm in a venture capital group, I think, Kevin's got a great company idea. I want us to fund it. I have to go persuade my partners that Kevin's business is worth putting money into. And if they've never invested in a space venture and haven't ever known anyone who did that, it just gets ruled out. Yeah. And so that level of those passionate billionaires sort of ruled in space opportunities in Silicon Valley at the start of this trend, which I think is an interesting aspect of that.
Thanks, Carissa. Did that answer your question?
I think yes, yeah. And in general, I would love to continue the conversation after, but yeah, thanks for the comments, Carissa.
Good. Other questions? There's one over there.
Sorry, I've snuck the microphone on the way past. Hi, I have a question on corporate investing. I work for a big corporate company. Can you talk a little bit about the best way that corporates can engage in investment and early stage investment?
Yeah, so I'll take a crack at that. I mean, what I find, and you may work with a company that's a little more mature. I typically work with some of the younger stage companies. I think the first rule that I have is be very concise about your business and how it is a business, not just the sciencey technology aspects. I've seen a lot of investors want to understand the concept that you're trying to sell, and space companies tend to overstate the technical details because that's what they're excited about. They need to understand, the investors need to understand who's your customer, what are you selling them, at what price point, and at what unit cost of economics. And if you start there, I think that's important. The second thing is investors are not immune to understanding that regulation is very, very important. And in a lot of early stage companies, they typically put off regulation until the last minute. And that can be very, very harmful to a space company because it often takes as much time to get through the regulatory hurdles as it does the technical program and the business financing and other aspects of the business.
What I would add is, and I'm not sure if you're a part of a space corporate, but we are talking to a lot of non-space corporates that are interested in potentially or have already invested in us. And I think what was important there was building an understanding of how space will be important for their industry in the future. Yeah. And that investing in space today is really securing that corporate's future in the future, and will not only help that, but also help their technology today. So building that story of how it's not really just an investment for ROI, but really an investment for the future of the business is very, very important to building that case.
If you look at an interesting case study is Japan, where there's been a very high level of corporate investment in venture startups, even from very early stages. And my view is that at least one of the reasons for that was the very specific and strong guidance, policy guidance the government provided around space as a priority for the nation. And I think that motivated that kind of future vision investment by corporations.
And we talk about the verticals, but the reality for a new business or a startup is every country, part of the world has a different ecosystem. Not every country has a Silicon Valley or the same venture capital. So the way of financing would be somewhat different in Europe and in Japan and or in the Middle East, etc. So the exact recipe is not the same. For sure, one thing that applies today that even the space industry, some of the leading organizations have the ability to invest together to some enterprise from outside of the space sector, etc. Certainly more than was the case 20 years ago. So there are a number of organizations that can also come together with more financial investors per se and be part of the game. So they're also approachable. There are examples of startups that got financed by a gas company and they were doing like sensors to have on board payload, and this was of interest to that particular business. So there can be interest, and more obviously large corporates have put together their own funds to support startup, etc. across the globe. So it's a matter of relevance to them and how they may leverage it sometime in the future.
And the good news is we're seeing more and more of that. Other industrial sectors are leveraging the easier access to space to say, hey, I've got a certain amount of money for an experiment, why don't I try a space experiment? And that demand pull, I believe, will create a next wave of innovation in space.
I must say, the one thing billionaires have done is first, there are many more Hollywood movies than ever about space, but even in terms of indeed some large corporate, that this is something to watch. Curiosity, turning curiosity into investment is a way to go, but at least curiosity is there. If you go to talk to any telco, any big logistics group worldwide, etc., at least they will have a look, say, okay, what can it bring to me? What is it about in that space business? Maybe they will invest or not, but they will at least open, the story for some of them at least.
Thanks. Okay, so we are out of time. However, I do not want to let these panelists go without my last question. Lightning round. You have no more than 15 seconds because we are out of time. What is the one thing, the one next step that needs to be taken, and by whom? I'll start with Donna, and we'll just go down, and 15 seconds. Or a little bit more if you want.
Okay, so I would say for the startup scene, it would be around building the stories around profitability and de-risking the businesses. And for governments, it's around how they can best support their industries as clients, and how they can build contracts that make sense where they're supporting them while pulling out if it's too risky as a profile for government.
Hope you're taking notes.
Okay, you took mine about profitability. That's a shame.
If you say something again, it just means it's
No,
doubly important.
if I want to tell something different, big milestones will be about, lunar exploration or space station. Some of it is a bit like biotech. You are the winner or not. So there are some of those games as well. You have to make large bets, and government will have to make decision and selection to enable at least one or several of those businesses to then go really to the next stage and deliver the promise and give the confidence and everything.
To go with the immediate next steps, the IAF needs to continue to use its connectivity, its power in nations around the world to communicate and educate and inform investor communities, broader investor communities, about space and space businesses. And that is what the Investment Task Force will be trying to do over the next year.
So I just go one step farther than that, is that we have to redouble our effort to communicate the social and economic value of space to everybody out there, the public at large, and as I said, key decision makers that have to spend money on lots of other things. We have to be able to describe in the terms they understand what the value of space is to them.
Thank you. Well, join me in thanking our amazing panel, and don't forget the 10 o'clock session on the practical aspects of investing. Thank you so much, panelists.